It was a quiet village nestled between the hills, where time moved slowly and life rarely changed. The people were simple, their routines familiar, and most of them had lived there their whole lives. In the center of this village stood a small, weather-worn church. Its wooden doors creaked when they opened, and the old bell in the tower rang with a voice that echoed through decades of memories. But while the church had its own kind of beauty, it wasn't the building that made it special, it was the mystery that surrounded it. A mystery in the shape of a cat. Every year, on the exact same day, June 13th, a small grand white cat appeared at the church door at sunrise. No one knew where it came from. No one had ever seen it on any other day of the year. The villagers called her Mira. She would sit there, unmoving, facing the door of the church. Her green eyes fixed as though she were waiting for someone to arrive, or perhaps waiting to be allowed inside. As sunset neared, without fail, she would stand up, glance one last time at the door, and vanish. No one saw where she went. Not even the children who tried to follow her, not even the priest who once stayed behind to keep watch. Over time, the story of the cat became part of the village's identity. Newer generations heard it from their parents and grandparents. Some believed she was a spirit, others said she was a sign from heaven. But no one could explain her connection to that one special date. Theories floated around. Maybe she belonged to a former priest. Maybe she had lost someone she loved. Maybe she had never truly been a cat at all. Father Elijah, the priest of the village for nearly 30 years, had grown old watching Mira's yearly visit. He never missed a single June 13th, always making sure he was there early in the morning to see her arrive. There was something haunting in the way she stared at the door, something that tugged at his heart. He remembered the first time he saw her, years ago, when he was a young man just assigned to the village. She had already been coming long before him. The elders told him she'd started showing up decades ago, long before even they could remember. One June 13th, something changed. Mira arrived, as always. She looked the same, though. No one could understand how she hadn't aged. Not a streak of gray, not a sign of weakness in her body. She sat at the door and waited. But this time, as the villagers gathered at a respectful distance to observe her silent vigil, something extraordinary happened. A child, one of the orphans the village took care of, stepped forward, slowly walking toward the cat. His name was Leo, barely 10 years old, shy and known for his quiet nature. His feet hesitated as he got closer, his hands trembling just slightly. But Mira didn't move. She watched him with those deep, knowing eyes. And when he sat down beside her, she pressed her side against him, resting her head on his lap. Gasps echoed through the crowd. Mira had never allowed anyone near her, not in decades. The villagers whispered among themselves, unsure of what this meant. Father Elijah, who had seen many strange things in his life, felt something shift in that moment, as though a door was opening, not a door of wood and hinges, but something deeper, something spiritual. Leo didn't speak much after that. Later, when the priest asked him gently what he felt when Mira touched him, he said something that left everyone cold and silent. She said she remembers. Father Elijah leaned forward. She spoke to you. Leo shook his head. Not with words. It was in my heart, like a feeling. She remembers someone. And she's sad. The mystery deepened. That night, Father Elijah stayed awake long after Mira disappeared again. He sat, alone in the pews of the darkened church, staring at the old portraits, the dusty altar, the flickering candlelight. He felt haunted not by fear, but by an overwhelming sense of longing. It was as if Mira's sadness had soaked into the walls. He began to search the old records the next morning. Parish logs, journals of priests long gone, handwritten baptism records, funeral entries. He searched for anything that could explain what happened on June 13th in the past. Hours turned to days. He barely slept. And finally, buried in a yellowed notebook tied with a ribbon, he found an entry dated more than 70 years ago. June 13th, the child never woke up. His mother screamed until her voice broke. She had brought him to the church every morning to pray. She believed the Lord would save him. And on this day, he slipped away in her arms on the church steps. We buried him under the rose tree beside the chapel. She refused to leave. For days she sat there. Her eyes were full of a pain I cannot describe. She said she would return. Until he returned to her. The mother's name was Mira. Father Elijah dropped the journal. Could it be? Could the cat be her? Was it her soul, trapped by grief, returning year after year to the place she lost everything? He looked out the window to where the old rose tree still bloomed, unaware of the centuries. And in the wind, he thought, he heard a whisper, soft, sorrowful, and full of love that had never faded. I remember. The journal lay open in Father Elijah's hands, his fingers trembling slightly as the words sank deeper into his heart. The name Mira echoed in his mind, blurring the line between the woman from the past and the cat who returned every June 13th. Could such sorrow bind a soul to the earth? Could love so deep, so painfully eternal, transform into a spirit that still searched? That night, the wind howled outside the church like a voice calling through time. The trees swayed as though whispering. Secrets too old for words. Father Elijah, unable to sleep, sat once more before the altar. The candlelight flickered, casting shadows that danced across the worn stone floor. He felt her presence, not the cat's, but the mother's, not her physical body. But something deeper, more ancient, woven into the very air. He returned to the old records in the following days, driven by a force he didn't fully understand. He needed to know who the boy was the child Mira had lost. The faded pages told him his name was Samuel. He had died at age 7, taken by an illness that medicine back then couldn't touch. His mother had prayed in that very church every morning for weeks. She believed in miracles. She had believed that faith could alter fate, but fate had not. Listen to Samuel had died in her arms on the stone steps outside the church, the same place where Mira now returned each year. His tiny grave lay beneath the old rose tree, its roots entwined with time and memory. Mira had refused to leave. The records said she stayed there for days without food, without sleep, her arms wrapped around an empty blanket, and then disappeared. No one ever found her body, no death record, no farewell letter. She had simply vanished, like smoke from a candle blown out in the wind. Some believed she had wandered into the forest to die. Others thought she had gone mad and fled. But now, decades later, a cat bearing her name returned to that exact place on that exact date. Father Elijah's heart grew heavy. The mystery wasn't just a ghost story. It was grief pure, bottomless grief that had etched itself into the earth. And that grief had chosen a shape to return in. Perhaps Mira had prayed so fiercely that her soul bound itself to her pain. Perhaps her love refused to rest. He shared his discovery with the village council. At first, there was silence, then disbelief. But after Leo spoke again quietly, shyly, his voice barely rising above a whisper, the room turned to ice. "She's not waiting for someone to come back," the boy said. "She's waiting for someone to forgive her. Forgive her." The room fell still. Father Elijah looked into Leo's eyes and saw something far older than any 10-year-old should carry. It was as though the boy had touched something sacred. Maybe even divine. He visited the rose tree the next morning, kneeling beside the unmarked grave. The blooms swayed in the breeze, pink petals fluttering to the ground like quiet tears. He whispered into the soil, speaking to a woman long gone, unsure. "If she could hear you, don't have to wait anymore. He's at peace now. You can rest too." But the silence didn't answer. The days passed quickly after that. June 13th faded behind them, and summer settled into the village like a warm sigh. Mira had not returned since that evening, and the villagers carried on with life. But Father Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that the story was far from over. If anything, it was only beginning, and then something strange happened. Leo disappeared. He had gone out one morning to walk to the church garden, a place he loved, where the birds sang loud and the flowers stood in a quiet kind of joy. But he didn't return. The village searched everywhere, the fields, the hills, the nearby woods. No sign, no footprints, no trace. But then someone found something near the rose tree, a single grand white cat hair, a child's drawing tucked under a stone. It showed a cat, a tree, and a boy holding her paw, both looking up at a light in the sky. No one knew what it meant. Father Elijah kept the drawing. He hung it inside the church, right beside the altar. People came to see it, some cried, some simply stared, and on the morning of the next June 13th, just as the sky began to blush with the first touch of dawn, Mira returned, but she wasn't alone. She walked slowly to the church door, as always. But beside her walked Leo. His hand rested on her back as he moved. His body was solid, his eyes calm. He didn't speak, but his smile told 1,000 stories. They sat together by the door, just like before. But something was different this time. There was no sorrow in her eyes, only peace. And when the sun began to set, they stood up and vanished. Not into the woods, not behind a tree, into the air, like a blessing. The village was never the same after that June 13th. Whispers traveled through the streets like wind through the wheat fields. People didn't know what they had seen, but they had seen it clearly, plainly, with their own eyes. Cat who had been nothing but a silent visitor for generations, and a boy who had disappeared without a trace, sitting side by side like two souls finally found. And then they were gone.
Not in the way the missing are gone,
Leaving pain behind, but in the way a prayer disappears into heaven, like something sacred had been released. Father Elijah stood at the church door for hours after. The village stayed quiet that day. No children played. No carts rolled by. Everyone kept to their homes, windows open slightly, as if afraid to miss something more, but nothing else happened. The moment had passed. And yet, something inside the church had shifted. The scent of roses lingered longer than usual. The candlelight inside seemed brighter, though no new candles had been lit. A warmth remained in the air, not the heat of summer, but something softer, like an embrace too large to be physical. Father Elijah found himself praying more in the days that followed, not because he was seeking answers, but because he was giving thanks. Something had been mended. Some wound in the spirit of the village had quietly closed. But deep inside, he still felt a pull, a question, still unanswered. Why? Leo, what connection did the child have to Mira or to Mira? He returned once more to the records. Not out of duty, but out of a yearning to understand the threads that tied souls together across time. Leo had been brought to the village orphanage when he was only 2 years old. No last name, no record of birth. The sisters, who took him in, said he had been found at the doorstep, wrapped in a thin blue blanket, with a silver pendant around his neck. The pendant. How had he never thought of that before? Father Elijah rushed to the orphanage, where Sister Clara met him at the door, surprise in her eyes. She led him to the storage room, where they kept lost items from children who had come and gone. After some searching, they found it a simple silver locket, cool in the palm, worn at the edges. Opened it gently. Inside was a small sketch, faded with time, of a woman holding a baby. And behind it, a name engraved in delicate C-U-R-S-I-V. Samuel, his heart stopped. It couldn't be, but it was. The child Mira had lost, had returned, somehow, through the impossible turns of fate. He had come back not in the form of memory, not as a spirit, but as a living, breathing child. A boy named Leo, who had unknowingly carried the soul of the one Mira had grieved for. Every year, and Mira had known, not through recognition of his face, but through the silent bond that only love beyond death could recognize. That was why she had rested her, head on his lap. That was why she had stayed longer that year. That was why she had finally let go. She had found him, and in that reunion, quiet and unseen by most, her wandering spirit had found peace. Not because he remembered her, but because he was whole, alive, safe, and loved by people who had unknowingly finished the story she had started so long ago. Father Elijah wept not from sorrow, but from awe. He placed the locket beside the boys. Drawing near the altar, visitors now came from other towns to see the strange display. Some believed it was a legend. Others felt something stir inside their hearts as they looked at the tiny symbols of love that spanned lifetimes. The rose tree outside the church bloomed more than ever that year. Its petals were softer, its fragrance stronger, and under the shade of its branches, the villagers began to gather every June 13th, not to look for the cat, but to remember the story, a story of love that crossed lifetimes, of grief that could not be silenced, of a mother's eternal vigil, and of a quiet little boy who had unknowingly brought an end to a sorrow that even time had failed to erase. On the third year after Mira's final appearance, a new priest was assigned to the village. Father Elijah had passed peacefully in his sleep, a smile on his face. In his final journal entry, written the night before he died, were the words, "She found him, and he brought her home." The new priest, young and curious, read the village's story with a skeptic's eye. He didn't believe in spirits or fate, but on his first June 13th in the village, he stood at the church door as the sun rose, just in case. No cat came, no boy appeared. But when he turned toward the rose tree, a soft breeze brushed his cheek, and in the air, carried like a song too quiet to sing, came a whisper. Thank you. The village grew quieter in the years that followed. There were still weddings at the old church, still Sunday sermons, still children laughing in the garden where Leo once played. But ever since Mira and Leo had vanished, something in the hearts of the people had changed, not with fear or confusion, but with reverence. It was as though they had been given a secret, a gift too large for words. The church was no longer just a building. It had become a place where time had bent, where a story far bigger than any of them had unfolded. The rose tree remained at the edge of the chapel, strong and blooming even through the harshest winters. The petals had deepened into a richer pink, almost crimson, as if the roots remembered the tears once shed into the soil. People began to leave letters at the base of the tree notes to loved ones they had lost, prayers whispered in ink. No one told them to do it. It just began one year and never stopped. Some claimed their letters were answered not in words, but in dreams. One woman swore she saw her late husband standing beneath the tree, smiling as he had on their wedding day. A child said her grandmother visited her in a dream that smelled like roses. The priest tried not to encourage these beliefs, but deep inside, he began to feel it too, the strange and beautiful sense that something unseen still moved through the village. And then came the question no one wanted to ask, but everyone felt. Stirring? Could it happen again? Was Leo the only one? Was Mira's vigil complete, or was the door still open for others? One spring morning, a family arrived in the village. They were quiet people, with sad eyes and worn hands. Their youngest child, a girl named Eliza, had not spoken in nearly 2 years. Doctors found no cause. They said it was emotional. Maybe it was grief. But the family said she hadn't experienced anything traumatic. She just stopped speaking one day, as though the world had gone silent inside her. They moved into a cottage near the church, hoping that the quiet countryside would heal something the cities had broken. Eliza spent hours by herself. She would sit under the rose tree, tracing the bark with her fingers, drawing pictures in the soil with twigs. Her parents worried, but something about her stillness was calming. She didn't cry. She didn't panic. It was as though she was listening to something no one else could hear. The priest noticed her one afternoon and approached gently. She looked at him and gave a tiny nod. Then, using her finger, she drew something in the dirt. A cat, and beside it a boy. His breath caught. He leaned closer. "Do you know them?" Eliza didn't answer with words. She simply closed her eyes and smiled. The priest didn't know what it meant, but something in that smile felt like a thread being pulled loose in the universe. As June approached, the villagers grew tense, hopeful, quiet. They didn't speak about it out loud. But everyone felt at the return of the date that had become more than just a number. June 13th was now sacred. That morning, people gathered at a distance, watching the church from behind fences, porches, gardens. The sunrise poured golden light over the rooftops, and the air smelled faintly of roses. Eliza stood alone at the church door. She was barefoot, her little white dress gently moving in the breeze. And then the impossible happened. Mira appeared. She looked the same as always, gray and white fur, green eyes, a body untouched by time. She walked slowly to Eliza, who knelt down and held out her hand. Mira touched her nose to the girl's fingers. The villagers gasped. Then Eliza spoke, for the first time in years. Her voice rang out soft and clear. She said, "I'm not broken." She said, "The silence is where the truth lives." Tears flowed freely among the watchers. Her parents ran forward, falling to their knees in joy and disbelief. Eliza looked at them, her voice steady, as if she had never been silent at all. She said, "She remembers me. She remembers the girl I was before the world made me forget. And now, I remember her too." The priest fell to his knees. How could this be? Mira was not just a spirit of grief. She was more. She was a guardian of memory, a keeper of something beyond words, a soul that had chosen not to move on until she could help others do the same. This time, she didn't vanish at sunset. She walked around the church grounds, brushing past the graves, curling up at the foot of the altar inside. She stayed the whole night, as though keeping vigil for everyone who had ever lost a piece of themselves. And in the morning, she was gone again. But Eliza was not. She was full of light, her voice now part of the world again, as she spoke gently. Not often, but always with meaning, as though she knew more than a child should. She began drawing everyday images of stars, trees, doors, and always. A cat with emerald eyes. The villagers never questioned her. They accepted that some mysteries were not meant to be solved, only witnessed, only felt, and they began to believe that Mira hadn't just been a mother's spirit, she had become something more, a bridge between what is lost and what can still be found. Years passed like gentle waves brushing against the same familiar shore. The village remained, quiet and slow, holding on to its sacred rhythms and old stone walls. The church, weathered and ancient, still stood at its center, its doors creaking. Open each Sunday morning? But something had changed deep within its heart of presence. A memory. A quiet understanding that some things walked alongside time rather than within it. June 13th became more than a date. It became a pilgrimage. People from distant towns, cities, even other countries came to see the rose tree, to touch the stone steps where the cat had once sat. Many came with stories of their own grief, too deep to speak aloud, questions that had no answers, longings buried under years of silence. And some left with tears, not because they found what they were searching for, but because somehow the place had reminded them that they were not alone in the searching. Eliza grew up in that village. Her voice, once lost in silence, became a gentle song in the lives of those around her. She painted, she wrote, and sometimes she spoke about the cat, not as a ghost, not as a miracle, but as a memory, a reminder of something that still lingered just beyond the edge of sight. She came when the world forgot me. Eliza once wrote in a book that was later passed from hand to hand like a sacred text. And when I remembered myself, she let go, but not completely. She remains in the place between what was and what still aches. She's a watcher, a whisper, a soul that stayed behind for those too fragile to remember who they are. The rose tree never stopped blooming, not even in the hardest winters. Its blossoms became a symbol across the region. Artists painted it. Children wore little pink flowers pinned to their shirts every June, and the tradition grew. On June 13th, people wrote letters not just to the dead, but to themselves, to their past, to the parts they had buried. They tucked the letters under stones by the rose tree. Somehow, just like before, they left feeling lighter. The legend of Mira began to shift. Over time, some said she had been a grieving mother. Others said she was the spirit of love itself. But no matter the version, one. Truth remained in every retelling. She had waited. She had waited for a soul she lost. She had returned each year without fail, through cold and rain, through silence and time, carrying a memory so deep that even death could not swallow it. And when she finally found what she waited for, she gave something back to the world: hope. There were those who claimed they still saw her from time to time. Not every year, and not always at the church, Some said they glimpsed her in hospital hallways, sitting beside a crying child, walking silently through a cemetery, appearing at the foot of a bed where someone lay holding a picture of someone they had once loved, always still, always watching, never asking for anything, just being there. The new priest who took Father Elijah's place never tried to explain the miracles. He simply kept the church open every June 13th from dawn until midnight, and he made sure the candles were always lit. And when people came with tears in their eyes and stories heavy on their hearts, he said the same thing to them all. She comes for those who wait. Eliza eventually moved away, but she returned every year. She never stopped bringing fresh roses for the tree, never stopped sitting by the stone bench with her sketchbook on her lap. And though she never spoke of it directly again, one day when she was much older, she left a small painting on the altar. It showed a little boy with a silver locket, a gray and white cat beside him, and a woman kneeling under a tree. Her eyes, lifted to the sky, glowing with tears and joy all at once. Beneath the painting, in soft handwriting, were the words, "Some love does not fade, some souls do not sleep, and some doors open only when the heart remembers." How to knock, Mira was, never seen again in the way she had been. But those who believed, truly believed, said they still felt her in quiet rooms, in quiet prayers, in quiet hearts. Because sometimes, a story doesn't end when the last word is spoken. Sometimes, it becomes part of us. A silent guardian, a watchful friend, a cat who only appeared at the church door on one special date, not because she was lost, but because someone still needed to be found.